Tá fáilte mór romh ag seminar gréasán an léonú. Sulla dosaíonn bhhailm cura a thuairt Dave ag códáil damhne an práta I maileatha clia in Nearah Bhealtaine. You're very welcome to today's webinar. Before I get started, I'd like to invite you to join us in Dublin in late May for the World Potato Congress. And at this stage, I'd like to acknowledge and thank our sponsors for the event. I think they, I suppose, provide us with the capacity to undertake this event, and I'm sure it's something that will be very interesting. We've a very exciting lineup ahead. So just to give you an idea of what I'm going to present today, I'm going to give, I suppose, an overview of late blight in Ireland. From an Irish perspective, late blight, as everybody will know, has had some huge consequences. And I suppose what I want to do today is to maybe look at how we, I suppose, have managed the disease over the last number of years. I titled it Taming the Beast. I think in reality, we probably haven't tamed it. We've come to understand it better and manage it maybe accordingly. Just a quick introduction to who I am. My name's Stephen Kildea. I'm a researcher in Teagasc, which is the Agriculture and Food Development Authority in Ireland. And I suppose I've been working from a trial and research perspective for late blight for the last maybe 14 years. And I suppose some of the results that I present in the current webinar is what we've observed in that, I suppose, period of time, the changes that have taken place. So just before I start, this presentation itself will probably last for about maybe 30 minutes, after which, look, there is time to take some questions, comments, etc. And to do so, if you have any during the presentation, please enter them into the questions and answers tab at the bottom of your screen, and I will answer them at the end. So look, in Ireland, we have a history with potatoes and of course with Phytophthora infestans, the cause of late blight. I put up a quotation here from a letter that was sent by Mr. John Molloy, who was a farm manager in Thurles, which is in the south of the country, on the 18th of July, 1847, to his landlord, basically highlighting the issues that he was observing as he was going across the country in that, I suppose, early or mid-July of that year. And one thing he did note in the letter was that he was seeing, I suppose, the rot of potatoes on the stalk, etc. But one thing of note in that letter that was sent was that in one of the last lines he says is that if the potato goes this year, Ireland will never recover. Now, we know that, look, it had a huge impact, and being honest, look, from the population perspective, we've actually in Ireland only come back to levels of population that are around that level in about 1850 in the last couple of years. So it had a huge impact, and to a certain extent, we are still recovering. When you come to Ireland, you will hopefully see, or if you do arrive in Ireland for the Congress, you'll hopefully see some memorials throughout the country. And this one that depicts, I suppose, a family walking towards the boat in Dublin is very poignant and sort of giving an indication of what is happening or what happened around that time. As I suppose a researcher that I'm in the field every year, and I suppose from a trials perspective, I can see the impact of the disease on the potato crop. It always, I suppose, almost catches my breath every year when I walk into the trials and I can see the decimation that this one pathogen can cause on the crop. Granted, I understand exactly why it is causing that. I can understand the pathogen. We can manage it, and in adjacent plots we have plots that are nice and green, and as you'll see in a few pictures a few slides later. But for these people, they didn't fully understand it. And was this something come from God? Or they did not understand. But the impacts and the devastation that it causes was very clear. So with that in mind, look, I'm going to give a quick overview, I suppose, of late blight and management, etc., that we have in Ireland. And some of the, I suppose, is the change in phase of potato production. My colleague Dennis Griffin in the last webinar gave a very good overview of, I suppose, the varietal resistance and how that has changed since I suppose the time of the famine, up into actually the modern technology and the breeding technology that it is utilised in current programs and is being deployed onto the farm. I give an overview of, I suppose, Phytophthora infestans, the pathogen from an Irish perspective, where we currently are at with it and what we currently do, what's happening maybe in Irish fields, and then maybe some of the future potential and challenges, etc. So I'm just going to take a few slides that Dennis would have presented in the last webinar, because I think it's still of importance, and it's important to recap it, especially from a late blight perspective. look, the area under production of potatoes from, I suppose, just around that time of the famine up into currently has dramatically decreased. We've changed, I suppose, in terms of our production. Why it has been changed, it is more in terms of a speciality. It's a crop that, I suppose, isn't for subsistence in Ireland at the moment, for example, where it would have been in those times over 170 years ago. However, even though it does continue to decline, we, as Dennis highlighted in the last webinar, we have seen an increase in the overall output, even though our, I suppose, area under production has declined. And this, as Dennis highlighted, was related to, I suppose, improvement in genetics, etc., of the potatoes that we are planting. Dennis also highlighted that there was a number of years where we saw some dips in terms of the output that was there. He highlighted 2018, which was very much a drought year. It was unusual, and we saw a restriction in the amount of production, the amount of output that was coming in 2018. But in 2012, we also saw that dip. And as Dennis highlighted, this was down to extremely wet weather and a combination, I suppose, of getting crop in, getting crop out, but also the wet weather would have had a huge impact on the blight pressure that would have been in fields. I also then would also highlight, and Dennis didn't in his talk, but I'd also highlight the 2008 and 2009 seasons where we also saw a dip. Again, it was wet weather that was causing this. But in addition to the wet weather, we were also seeing a change in the population of Phytophthora infestans at that time. And it's something that I'd highlight over the next few slides. So in terms of the production that has changed, as Dennis previously highlighted, look, we, in I suppose the famine era, it was a variety called lumper that was very susceptible to blight, a very high yielding variety at the time. But we've moved into more a sort of a specialized sort of role in terms of potatoes. We're multi-purpose, where we were feeding ourselves, maybe feeding animals, but now we're actually feeding ourselves. And even at that, the market is going to be specialized, where it would be for wear, whether it be for processing, chipping, etc. So it is changed. And of course, on top of that, we know that we have targeted disease resistance and late blight being, I suppose, the major one that we do try to target. But also, look, we also have seen changes in, I suppose, the distribution of production. In that famine era, we would have had production, I suppose, scattered throughout the whole country, while now actually a lot of our production is very much specialized to certain regions. You can see actually Dublin being based here, so you can imagine that the urban centre, we have a lot of production around that urban centre. We also have Cork was another urban centre. We also have a sort of a higher level of production there. And then traditionally sort of areas such as the southeast, we would have a high production, but also then up in the northwest, there's also a slightly higher level of production. We can look at it actually then from the aspect of production in terms of the agronomy, etc., and being able to get crops into the ground and grow, I suppose, high yielding crops. We can look at it from the spring sort of weather that we were looking at, and we can see that, look at the areas in that northeast would be, I suppose, typically drier, and I suppose they're also heavier soils. So even though they are dry, they won't necessarily run out of water in the summer months. Slightly cooler also will have an impact on that. But what we'd also look at it then is the components that are going to be making up, I suppose, late blight pressure will be those sort of aspects in terms of the temperature and the rainfall and humidity. And I suppose previously we would have been looking at effective blight hours, so conditions, amount of hours, or the accumulation of hours that are, I suppose, conducive to the spread of late blight. And I suppose an historical look of these over, I suppose, from the 1950s to the 80s would demonstrate that effect of, I suppose, the differences in terms of the pressure that might be sort of exerted on the crop. Where down in the southwest, we have some very high pressure environments. As we move over to the southeast, there's still some high pressure environments, but previously, as you saw, we probably have a slightly higher temperature and maybe more sunlight, while in the northeast, we have slightly lower levels of pressure, but still significant levels of pressure from a late blight perspective. And that does actually lead us to look, in most seasons, are conducive to late blight in Ireland. Some work conducted by our previous colleague Leslie Dowling, looking at the 25 years of data, and I suppose running up until the mid-2000s, where we had seen a shift in population, probably starting in the early 80s. But we could see that actually in almost all years, we were in the very high levels of disease basically occurring in it. You could see that some seasons, yeah, we had absolutely no blight, such as 1995, but that was the exception, where it was an extremely dry season. Then you had other seasons that, I suppose, we had some very high pressure, but we had, I suppose, some very good levels of efficacy being achieved by the different fungicides. And I suppose the pictures on my right-hand side of the slide here just give an example of that from 2021 in the season, where we have an untreated, where we have no fungicide applied, and we can completely see that we've got completely decimation of the plot. On the right-hand side, we've got a protectant fungicide being applied at a weekly basis. In this instance, I do know there is some blight in these plots here, but we can see the clear difference in terms of the level of efficacy that is being achieved there. So it is a case that actually, look, a lot of seasons will be conducive to blight, and at that we can get some exceptional high pressures. Dennis highlighted this, Dennis Griffin, colleague, highlighted this in the last webinar, but this is one of those sort of slots and sort of positions where, as I say at the start, I said at the start of the presentation, it does catch my breath, because and it is one, look, it's over 10 years ago now that these pictures were taken, but in reality it sort of still does almost put those hairs sort of standing on the back of my neck, where in the 10th of July, we sort of saw a small outbreak of blight at this point in the field. Just over 2 weeks later, we walk into the field, we're left with this. It's, I suppose, from a breeder's perspective, it's not necessarily what you want to see from getting a lot of varieties. There's some very good resistant ones there, but you can see a lot of stuff is sort of wiped out. But that's immense pressure. You can clearly see where those plots were at the very start, or where that initial outbreak started. But the speed at which that I suppose epidemic developed was quite startling to see. But it's not just the odd season. 2020 was another year where pretty much exactly the same. I went on holidays at the start of August with 1 or 2 lesions of blight. I came back maybe 10 days later, and it was almost looking like this. From a trials perspective, it's not the best, being honest. In terms of when we see blight starting to arrive in Ireland, look, and this is using Leslie's sort of data, going back for the 25 years period, where he would have monitored the plots almost at a weekly basis. And you can see that actually, look, a lot of what we're seeing in terms of blight arrives in that latter half of July and into August. Now, this is, I suppose, it's no real surprise that we would see this like this. It's a relationship between, I suppose, the pathogen being able to build up to epidemic proportions so that it can spread, and where the inoculum is coming from, etc. But also then, of course, temperatures are going to be rising, the humidity will be rising, etc. And there mightn't be the conditions, optimum conditions for the spread earlier than this. A lot of what we tend to see maybe at the start of the season and start when those first outbreaks of blight, especially in the trials where we don't allow, I suppose, or we don't treat with fungicides. You might see a lot of something like stem blight or tip blight, where it gets in, and as canopy is growing, it'll grow beyond that maybe to a certain extent as you have that rapid canopy, which can create, I suppose, difficulty in terms of controlling this pathogen at a commercial level. Because if you're having that stem blight and you've got rapid canopy growth, getting the fungicides down to that can be quite difficult. And it is something that, look, we would say very, very much to our growers and advisors, is that, look, you need to get into crops to see actually where that blight is, and match it accordingly in terms of that, if it's there, etc. So I'm not going to go over the 175 years of potato blight. I know Dr. Shearing, as part of the webinar in March 2021, give a very good overview of that. And I'll be honest, I've screen clipped one of his slides from the presentation, because I think it sort of gives a very good overview or example of what we sort of have learned about Phytophthora infestans. And he did make the point that we've underestimated it to a certain extent, and its ability to adapt. We know that it will adapt to, I suppose, lower temperatures, probably maybe some relative humidity, reduced life cycle. Look, we are typically probably into the 3 to 5 days of a life cycle now. It has demonstrated quite effectively an ability to overcome major resistances in the host and potato, and of course, to develop fungicide resistance. So that basically this is something that we've learned, and I suppose, can we look at that from an Irish perspective, and do these fit? I think they do, and over the next few slides I suppose demonstrate that, and I suppose then how we have to adapt to that, or can we even adapt to this, is going to be the question. And I think that change in populations is important, and adaptation. Now, in the previous slides, I presented some data that Leslie Dowling would have generated from, I suppose, the early 1980s through to the mid 2000s. And that was a relatively stable. There was some changes in the population, but it was relatively stable. In 2008, then we saw a change again in our population. And I suppose this really started to come to light in I suppose, 2009, where we started to get some very early levels of infection, but some quite damaging levels of infection also occurring. So here is a crop that I would have walked in the 19th of June. So even that little bit earlier than your typical example, typical where we would have been expecting it, I suppose, in late July. So we were into, I suppose, the second half of June here. We saw some damaging infections, and this is a crop that was in that southeast, so down in that Wexford area. But when we when we did our, I suppose, our mating type sort of analysis, we could see that there was almost a division in the country in terms of the mating type. And I suppose prior to this, the Irish population was dominated by the A1 strains, but we could see that actually on the East Coast, there was a dominance of that A2 population. Now, this also sort of coincided with, I suppose, a change in varietal resistances, or what looked like a change in varietal resistances, and we could see that from our own trials conducted as part of the breeding program, that in 2006, where we had the susceptible varieties Binchy and British Queen, you could see the relative AUDPC was relatively similar between the two seasons. But when you looked at the varieties Cara and Setanta, what you could see is that there was a clear shift in terms of their ability to resist the pathogen, particularly in Setanta, maybe not so much Cara. And this was actually very visible in the field, and we're using the resistant sort of variety Sapomere as a reference here, where Setanta up until this point probably would have looked very similar to this. And indeed, in 2008, I can specifically remember Leslie Dowling bringing me a sample that was coming from Setanta that basically he was surprised to actually see blight. And that was, I suppose, in the Oak Park, which is our research centre, that was probably the first outbreak of what was that 13A2 or Blue 13, what is called Blue 13 in 2008. And I suppose this is where the change in populations, and I know Dr. Shearing presented some of this, sort of an overview of this in his presentation last year, but as part of the Blight sort of, I suppose it's a program conducted in a collaborative program within Europe. A lot of the populations throughout Europe are monitored. And what you can see is that you can see the blue and the pink, the different genotypes, the different colors represent the different genotypes, fluctuating or changing during the different seasons throughout Europe. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a huge representation of the Irish samples within that database. But one thing we can say is that you can see a difference in terms of the colors. So if we just go back, you can see that, say, in the year 2011, 13, and 14, where we have some samples within Ireland, there's a very low representation of those yellow, sort of, which are that older 8A1 genotype in the wider European population. While in Ireland it is the dominant strain, and we continue to have quite a proportion of it up until relatively recently. To put that, I suppose, into the wider context, you can actually see that where I select years where we have, I suppose, data in the Blight database. You can see the Irish population possibly lags behind. It's not that we don't have those major genotypes, we do get them, most definitely. The question might be, why are those older ones still sort of persistent in Ireland? It is something that I suppose we would like to investigate and understand a little bit further, because if it's a case that we can, I suppose, manage what we know, and that's really what is important about managing what we know. Those sort of genotypes that may come in, if they present a different issue for us, whether our strategy of control may be required, may be different. So the Irish population probably does lag behind. As I say, we can see those newer sort of genotypes are definitely there. And it's about understanding what's actually happening from an Irish perspective. So within that sort of context, I want to ask a few questions about how does the Irish population respond, and some data that we would have sort of tried to generate over, I suppose, a number of years. And I suppose one of the aspects would be the impact of varietal resistance. We tend to grow maybe specific varieties that are probably a bit more specific to Ireland than elsewhere in Europe. But they're not necessarily don't necessarily have high levels of resistance. And this is some work that a PhD student conducted a number of years ago. Looked at I suppose, the impact of varietal resistance and categorized the resistance based on the AUDPC, what was happening in the field. And what you can see is that, look, as we went into those more resistant varieties, we were selecting for those more aggressive type genotypes at the time, which were your pink 6 and your 13A2. While the lower levels of resistance, okay, there was some selection compared to, I suppose, the susceptible control that we would have used was King Edward. You could see that there was some differences there between them. Basically, we also looked at this more recently in terms of, okay, we can see that there's an impact of that varietal resistance, but it also seems to be temporal. So basically, if we sample at the start of the season, we see that I suppose older genotypes tend to be present. While that if we go towards the end of the season, when possibly those more resistant varieties may be starting to lag in terms of the resistance, we can see that the more aggressive genotypes start to come through. So there may be some aspect of a temporal sort of selection maybe going on there at the same time. So within this, we've got 2 samples where we have all the samples that we would have collected within each time point. And they would include fungicide treated and untreated. While actually we can look then at the subsample of just the untreated and see almost a very similar effect. So not necessarily an impact necessary of say the fungicide treatments that would have been going on in these trials. And that does lead me then to a question about, I suppose, the impact of what fungicides may be having. And really, when we have a sensitive population to a certain extent, we can control it quite well with fungicides. And this is only 1 year of a number of years trials that would have been conducted and published by the PhD student Jeroen, where he looked at a range of different fungicide treatments applied during the season and sampled to see, look, is there an impact of the different treatments on the local population. There is some small fluctuation, but nothing overly dramatic for what you might be expecting in terms of selection that would occur if there was fungicide resistance there. Interestingly, look, Ridimil Gold would have been included in these trials, and we know that Blue 13, that 13A2 is phenylamiide or metalaxyl resistant, but we didn't actually see that huge level of selection. Now, Ridimil Gold in itself would have been a product, but it would have been mixed with mancozeb at the time. So whether that is actually an indication of, I suppose, the strength or benefit from resistance management, including an additional mode of action, possibly. But look, we know from a commercial level that actually, look, relying on something like that Ridimil Gold was actually going to, it wouldn't provide that control required. So it's interesting to note that maybe it's an aspect of the population structure at this time. Now we can fast forward into 2021, straight away, the one thing that we can see is that the colors are different. The genotypes are actually different. So even though up until relatively recently, we had this quite, I suppose, almost stable population where we had older genotypes mixing with relatively newer genotypes. Within the space of about 2 seasons, we've changed that, and this is a local population conducted at the research centre, completely natural inoculum. We never actually inoculate any of the trials. We allow infection to develop naturally from local sources, and the one thing that we can see is that we have the odd isolate or the odd strain of the older population still there. Even less of, I suppose, the newer or the relatively newer, the pink 6 or your 6A1, no 13A2 within the population. But one thing that does jump out is that, look, the fluosinam aspect, we can clearly see that we are selecting strains specific to a specific genotype based on fluosinam. And we know that this 37A2 has reduced sensitivity to fluosinam. So clearly it is a case that actually, look, that if we have those strains in the population, if we rely on the individual sort of fungicide, if there is resistance there, we will have really strong selection for it, as is evident by the trial in 2021. I should say it was also similar in 2020. So that does lead me then to, okay, we do have our chemistry. We have a certain range of varieties that we will be relying upon. I suppose market will dictate what, I suppose, growers will be putting into the ground. And reality is that they're not necessarily all very resistant to late blight. So we are moving into a scenario where more of these aggressive sort of genotypes are emerging, and we're relying more on the fungicides for control. And at the same time, we're under increasing pressure from a regulatory point of view in terms of fungicide availability. So the question, okay, becomes, can we sort of predict the pathogen better from an Irish perspective so that we can, I suppose, target or tailor our fungicide programs better? And this is something that isn't sort of new. And this is something that has been, I suppose, trialed and It's constantly looked at for maybe over 60, 70 years at this stage. And from an Irish perspective, it would have been conducted originally in the early 1950s in what would have been called the Irish Rules or Burke's Laws, and it would have been operated by the Irish Meteorological Service. It's relatively conservative in nature, and I think this maybe reflects the period at the time where, in terms of varietal resistance, we had a huge number of varietal resistance, we hadn't a huge range of fungicides available. So in that sort of aspect, if we are going to be reliant on a small number of fungicides and they are relatively costly and we're limited in how much we can put out, we want to be able to, or we needed to be able to apply these at absolutely critical points. So it was relatively conservative in nature, so that it was really those conditions that are really, really conducive to blight would have been highlighted. Its current usage, it's extremely limited at a commercial level at the moment, because it would not be relied upon because of that sort of conservative nature. The risk that is associated with late blight currently is at such a height that actually relying on something like this, the model is currently available, would open to, I suppose, the risk of a lot of disease development. So there has been a lot of changes since its first inception in terms of production and things like that. But a lot of what goes on in terms of it doesn't really change in terms of, look, there's a sporulation period, the conditions that are going to allow for sporulation of blight, and then an infection period that basically allows those spores that are produced to infect. So we did have, I suppose, a task of look at this a number of years ago and said, okay, look, we know that growers aren't necessarily going to be relying on this at the moment. Is that a case that it's probably maybe too conservative, not given enough warning, its predictive power is not where maybe we need it to be at? So we tasked the PhD student with actually reevaluating the model that is used in Ireland by the Met Service, and to make subtle changes if possible to this, to see if it could, I suppose, give us a better prediction, power of prediction, and then to actually say, look, if that's the case, can we maybe utilize this in the system to reduce our, I suppose, intensity of fungicide applications and our over-reliance maybe on fungicide applications. And the first step Mladen did, so Mladen Cusack was the PhD students. First step was to take some data from the breeding program, where we would have allowed blight to develop in the trials, and to, I suppose, to see, look, we have the weather conditions coming from a research centre, we have very good Met data available. Now, can we actually sort of predict, or look at the data and sort of say, can we improve the prediction that we are utilising? And I suppose what Mladen came up with was that we can improve the prediction somewhat. And I suppose what he sort of fell upon was a sort of, okay, maybe a slight change in the temperature, change in one of those periods in terms of infection to include relative humidity. Currently, it actually only included rainfall, and that actually does improve the power. So he brought a little bit forward and said, look, if I was to do this, and if I was to have a standard fungicide program, what theoretically could he bring in terms of a reduction of fungicide usage over that period of years? And he estimated that, look, if he was to utilize this system, and assuming that he was able to get good disease control from it, reliable disease control, it would provide a significant reduction in the overall pesticide usage or fungicide usage. But of course, that's theoretical. So we basically tasked him with bring it to the field, do the trials, and sort of demonstrate to us that can actually happen. So he working with Met-Ern and the university, Maynooth University, which he was based or is registered with. He's basically set about sort of providing this sort of a risk prediction sort of forecast system where the data was specific to the location, which is at the trial site that we had in Oak Park. But we also sort of asked, okay, we know that, look, we're growing, I suppose, more susceptible type varieties or susceptible varieties. If we were to include more resistant varieties in that mix, could this interact with such a decision support, and could we even reduce potential pesticide loads or fungicide loads even further? So within this sort of trial, he included a range of varieties, some of the commercially available, some of the most commercially available varieties from an Irish perspective, but also some of those model sort of varieties. I think Sarpamira was one, but also then taking something from the breeding program, Dennis's breeding program, and saying, look, we know there's material here coming from the breeding program. Can we incorporate this into such a system that we can manage blight accordingly? And as you can see, look, the trial perspective, we were spraying them on a weekly basis, depending, of course, on the output coming from the model, whether it was a low risk, medium risk, high risk, or very high risk. We adjusted the fungicide program based on that. There is, of course, scope to go a little bit further and sort of change, instead of changing the dosage, but to change the timing, to extend their intervals between applications, etc. But I think from a research purposes, we said, look, a weekly basis is the way we would look at it, because look, a lot of farmers will actually just go on that weekly basis to reduce that risk overall completely. And if they are doing that, do they necessarily need to be going with a full rate fungicide, or can they reduce that dosage? And I suppose, look, what he demonstrated was that there is definitely opportunities there to utilize this in terms of reducing the fungicide input. Clearly, there's a significant reductions to be made in terms of the number of applications and in the overall dose. And you can see that actually up in the varietal aspect, that there's a clear interaction with the variety, in that those varieties that are very resistant, and this is the clone coming from the breeding program and Sarpamira, you can see that actually in the year that I highlight, 2019, you can see that actually they provide very, very good control, and there would be very significant reductions potentially in the fungicide input on those. But even then, in exposed to more representative varieties such as Rooster in this scenario, which is the dominant in the Irish market, you can see that actually the two that are actually providing are I suppose, have the higher levels of disease, are the untreated, as you would expect, but also then the older sort of predictive model that is currently utilized. We can clearly demonstrate why farmers wouldn't necessarily utilize that in the field. But I suppose the modification that he made had a sort of a positive benefit, in that we were able to maintain disease control and match that, of course, then through into yield. So one of the other questions that we posed Mladen in this sort of work was, well, if we're doing all this and we know the population can change, and is it a case that actually we are going to end up pushing our population in a negative sort of way, or maybe potentially positive? So he did a lot of sampling during these trials, and look, he was able to demonstrate that, similar to the work that the other PhD student Jeroen had done, was that actually, look, more resistant varieties will select for those more aggressive genotypes in a clonal type population. And I suppose we're talking about a population here that at the start of the season contained only 3 major clonal lineages. We can't exclude potential lineages coming in and establishing, emerging within the population that are going to be unique. But we can see that actually, look, the varietal resistance, the stronger the resistance in terms of that, there was a clear advantage for those more aggressive type genotypes. In terms of the fungicide program, so we can see no real difference in terms of the fungicide program, whether it's a full rate, half rate, or the different type of models. There's very little difference between them, so they weren't impacting population, even though we were reducing our fungicide input. But also then, of course, look, we could see that even within that clonal population, there is differences between it in terms of the seasons that we do those sampling in. They will fluctuate depending on the season it is there, and that may be reflective of, I suppose, the overwintering of our inoculum, the initial inoculum sources, etc. And it is something that we do need to look at a little bit further in terms of how do we predict what I suppose the major lineage will be at the start of that season, given that we have a number of lineages potentially in the population. So we can say that, look, from this work, look, Met Éireann Meteorological Service are taking our changes on board, and they are going to utilize that. So they're aware that, look, this is for, I suppose, commercial level, but also they're aware that there is a lot of, I suppose, hobby gardeners that would have potatoes in their back garden that would rely probably on this type of a system, maybe more than sort of that commercial growers. So hopefully over the next month or so, that Met Éireann will release this sort of data where we have almost a heat map from an Irish perspective, running it on a 3-day, 4-day and 5-day forecast, predicting, I suppose, the risk based on the model output, where we have very low risk, no accumulation of those effective blight errors, the conditions that are going to be favorable to blight, low, medium, high, and just very, very high, being honest. And this is just a run from June of last year that shows that, look, we can almost see this warm front moving across Ireland, and if we were to run this maybe for another 2 days, you would see that red moves into the country and does move across. But in addition to that, they're actually they're also going to provide maybe a more location type specific piece of information that give a 10-day forecast, and it'll allow, I suppose, the user to log on and see how, I suppose, the effective blight errors, how the risk is changing over the period. it tends to what happens is that as the forecast gets closer to, I suppose, the date, the reliability will get stronger. And indeed, during Mladen's PhD, as he was forecasting, I suppose, the risk in the distance, you could see that actually something like this was extremely high risk. What is it, maybe 5, 6, 7 days out? As I got closer to the day, that risk lowered very considerably. So having that information is really of value, and I think we're hopefully going to have that sort of information provided to us in from this summer onwards, which will be very helpful. So in summary now, I suppose, look, late blight, I titled the talk Taming the Beast, but look, late blight, if it's allowed to go untreated, in an Irish perspective, will cause devastation. It hasn't changed. If anything, it has become more aggressive, as I think was highlighted by Dr. Shearing about a year ago. I suppose, what happens elsewhere in Europe will tend to make its way here eventually. So maybe it's a case that we can learn from what's happening elsewhere in Europe. We have some slight differences in terms of our climate, where we tend to be a little bit milder, especially during the winter months, maybe, than elsewhere in Europe, which, whether that has a consequence for overwintering of the strains or the lineages, it is something that I'd say we probably have maybe subtle differences there, but as I say, we can learn from elsewhere in Europe. The changes that are occurring, look, they do impact control, and really they're probably leading to more intensive control strategies in some scenarios. And that's, I suppose, a combination of the pathogen, but also the production system, the requirement, I suppose, for manage that risk. But I think, look, we do see that there is improvements in prediction models that do most definitely offer hope for more targeted control measures, and to utilize, I suppose, our tools more effectively, be that varietal resistance, but also some of those very effective fungicides that are available to us. And with that, look, I'd like to look, there's a lot of work that goes into a lot of those trials. Acknowledge, I suppose, the potato breeding program in Oak Park. There's a trialing team specifically for the pathology side, Deirdre Doyle and Jim Grace and Liam Shepherd. Of course, looked, a lot of the modelling work would have been conducted by Mladen, who's now in Penn State. Leslie Dowling and Eugene O'Sullivan, the past pathologists based in Oak Park, and some of the earlier work that Ewan Mullins and Ewan Sillenfer would have conducted. Likewise, look, Rowan Feely in Maynooth University, the guys at Met Éireann, of course, Louise Cook, who would have covered a lot of the work in Northern Ireland, and the genotype and the recent sort of genotyping work that we have been doing in collaboration with the Hutton Institute. So thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me today. And as I say, look, if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. Just stick them into the questions and answers tab at the bottom. So at this stage, look, I'll stop sharing my screen, and maybe I can take some of those questions that might well be in the questions and answers at this stage. So one of them here is, you have seen production regions move due to, have we seen production regions move due to climate? I don't think necessarily at the moment it's really they've changed due to climate, or I suppose in the west of Ireland it would be a lot more difficult to produce those crops. Also, look, it's a case on we can utilize I suppose that the population dynamics that are there in the markets are closer to the urban centre, etc. Are you seeing any current changes in your weather pattern that would shift those regions or cause changes in production patterns? I suppose, look, as Dennis would have highlighted and I highlighted earlier on, there are those years where we have either exceptional blight, such as the 2008, 2009 and 2012, and late in 2020, I should say, early 2020 was exceptionally dry. It was a drought. So it can definitely, in that there's some very high, I suppose, pressure seasons, but that they probably would have also occurred beforehand. The opposite may be the case, that if drought would be more of a concern, possibly, in terms of the weather, changing weather patterns. So our copper-based products used in Ireland for late blight, these would possibly only really be used in the organic sort of scenario, and would be a small amount of them used in the organic scenario. It wouldn't really be used from I suppose in the conventional, really because their efficacy would not be at the level that is required, I think, in terms of that. So from organic, there will be a higher, I suppose, price paid for the organic potato, so it can sort of compensate to a certain extent for that greater or higher risk that probably will be based on that and utilizing the copper. But as I say, from a commercial or conventional, I should say, there would be it would be too much of a risk to use those type of products. Are homeowners in Ireland aware of late blight, and do they manage their gardens for it? I think a lot of people would be very much aware of late blight in Ireland. Look, there is very much a history. It is taught, the whole aspect of late blight is taught in history in schools. And when you get into the senior levels in school, look, in terms of biology, from an aspect of microbes, Phytophthora infestans is one of the model sort of species that would be taught. But also from the homeowner's perspective, the Meteorological Service, Met Éireann, will also provide those or will issue those warnings for late blight as part of their forecasts. So it might seem strange, but at the end of the news, the daily news, if there was weather conditions that were conducive to blight, they would issue a warning. Now, I think they will probably maybe change that in terms of when the changes that are coming through to the model, because there's a lot more information available in terms of what they're going to make available, and they will sort of highlight people to go look at the information, because you can clearly see from that map that the risks may well be different depending where you are in Ireland. There is quite a few people that would still, I suppose, grow potatoes in their back garden. It is something that we try to make, I suppose, commercial growers aware that they should be aware where potatoes are potentially grown other than in their fields, because they can be a source of inoculum, and it is important for them to be aware of that, to see that. And I suppose, look, it's not a case that they will spray, I suppose, a garden, but they will take, I suppose, be more aware of it from their own perspective, so that they can take a greater sort of care of their crop that might be in close proximity to that. So one of the questions, do your growers submit samples for late blight identification? We try every year to get, I suppose, samples sent into us through our advisory service. We are successful to some extent in getting that. I think one of the problems from the aspect of a grower's perspective is that if they see blight, they tend to actually go and spray that straight away. If you have blight, and being honest, we cannot sort of fault them for that. If they have blight and if it's active, then they need to take care of it. So getting the sample to us isn't necessarily always going to be their priority. That said, look, we can only give advice in terms of changing the population if we have that information. So it is a case that we try to get as much as possible. Does the disease prediction model take into account the size of the inoculum? No, it doesn't take into account the size of the inoculum that will be there. And I think this is one of the difficulties that it is posed from those predictions. It is a case of where is that inoculum coming from exactly. We know that, look, from an Irish perspective, it is very much a clonal sort of population. So it's more than likely either going to come from dumps, discard dumps coming from, I suppose, after grading, etc. Volunteers from previous crops, or indeed potentially the odd bit of seed that might have had a bit of infection in it. But whether that load will be low or high, etc., it is very difficult to actually say that, being honest. Are you surprised in how you keep seeing several genotypes of the pathogen, as well as A1 and A2? Yes, this is a bit of a surprise, and I suppose one of the things that we were very concerned about in 2008, when we first saw this change in the arrival of the A2 mating type. We were very concerned that actually, look, we thought we might end up with basic sexual reproduction and the production of oospores, increasing diversity, and then the problem of oospores in the soil. That's something that we haven't seen. Now, whether that's a reflection on the specific clonal genotypes that dominate the population, or whether it's actually a reflection on the climate that we have and allowing those, I suppose, genotypes to overwinter quite effectively, it is something that we're not sure. But it definitely is a surprise that they still keep popping up. But it may well be, as I say, a reflection of their survival over the winter months. Another question is related to the loss of mancozeb. Will the loss of mancozeb put pressure on remaining fungicide groups to the point where there is a risk of breakdown in the ability to control blight? I suppose for one of the questions might be, our reflection is that within Europe, mancozeb has been sort of removed from the market, and a lot of products had mancozeb in them over the last number of years. However, there is a diversity of fungicides that are available, and I think at this stage, we weren't necessarily relying on mancozeb in recent years for control. That said, the loss of a fungicide that has been, I suppose, on the market for maybe 50 years is always sort of it's a loss, and it was included in a lot of products from, I suppose, that anti-resistance type strategy. It was a low risk type fungicide. I think we probably can manage what we currently have, but it is going to be down to how we manage it. Not relying, I suppose, overly on any individual mode of action, mixing where possible, and of course then removing the pressure that we place on those fungicides. So if we can reduce the disease pressure where we don't need to be using as much fungicides, that of course will also help. I suppose there's a question here: any signs of other changes in fungicide sensitivity following the metalaxyl and fluazinam, or is best practice FRAC working well? It's a very interesting sort of question. I think the scary thing about blight is that when that resistance does emerge, and we can see it in the field, it has an immediate dramatic effect. When you have a pathogen that's able to cycle within 3 to 4 days or 5 days, it can build up an inoculum exceptionally quick. Now that said, I suppose, look, the metalaxyl issue was one that sort of identified, look, it is a problem, and Phytophthora infestans can develop resistance. But for a long time then, it was quite stable in terms of other modes of action that would have been applied, and they're applied quite intensively, haven't developed resistance. That is until the recent issue with fluazinam. So I do think, look, it brings back into focus that, look, the metalaxyl wasn't just that once off. I think the potential for resistance to develop to the other major modes of action is definitely there. And I think then, as I said to the previous question, that we have to manage blight accordingly in terms of reducing the pressure that we are putting these fungicides on. And that also includes how we best use them, whether that is alternating them and mixing them as much as possible. And I suppose we do know how to manage fungicide resistance. It's just getting that into practice and making sure that that's applied is important. So the next question: is it expected to get a population structure dominated by a sexually derived oospore production like in the northern countries? Can this displace the current clonal lineage domination? This is something I hope we don't do. I think it is a case that as we get a clonal population, okay, the immediate sort of issues arise in terms of how do we manage it. But after a period of time, we very quickly address how we can manage that. And if we know then that is going to be one of maybe 5 or 6 lineages that are going to dominate the population in any given year, we can manage that. I think the issue would come like that in terms of oospore production, where we don't know what type of strain potentially will arise, and it could be multiple strains that will arise. Now, as I say, we don't necessarily know why that doesn't occur in Ireland, because as I say, from 2008 onwards, when we had the A2 and A1 in the same field, in very close proximity, maybe even in the same plant, we didn't seem to get, I suppose, a really divergent type population. They were clearly, what was coming every year was one of maybe 3 or 4 clonal lineages, and no appearance of sort of oospore derived population anyhow. It doesn't mean that the oospores weren't produced, and whether they were able to survive the overwintering or not. It may be a case that they basically got in the soil and germinated, and therefore had no host and weren't able to survive. That may be the case. We don't know, but it is something, as I say, I think we would prefer to have a clonal lineage that we know what we can tackle and how we can tackle it. So one of the final questions then is, as many potato fungicides products marketed in Ireland are based on fluazinam, both strains and co-formulated, and blight strains showing reduced sensitivity to active, has this material had its day as an effective material? I think in the current sort of situation, you would say that we would not recommend it. I should say we don't recommend it for usage, because the risk is very high, and it will typically would have been a fungicide that would have been used at the end of the season for tuber blight control. And that, look, is a very risky sort of scenario, because if you can't rely on that preventing tuber infection, and potatoes are put into store for 6 to 8 months, you might be questioning what sort of potatoes might come out at the very end of that. Now, that said, it is based on really only that clonal lineage at the moment, from an Irish perspective anyhow, and is a case that, look, will that disappear? Will we manage that? Are we maintaining that in the population due to the use of fluazinam? If fluazinam isn't used for a number of years, will that clonal lineage die out? And at which stage I suppose the fluazinam could be reintroduced into the market and be quite effective. That's something that, look, I suppose we'll have to look at, and time will tell to a certain extent. But in the current sort of situation where we have that green 37, dark green 37, which does demonstrate reduced efficacy, I think our recommendation would be not to rely upon it for disease control. So I think that's a lot of the questions there now. So I might end the webinar at this stage. And again, look, thank you for taking the time out today to listen to me talk about, I suppose, something that does exercise us over here in Ireland, especially in July and August, September. And hopefully, look, we'll see some views in Dublin in late May and early June for the Potato Congress. So thank you very much.